I'd been driving for what felt like forever, 2 hours at least, to the Marriott in Baltimore. My wife, Claire, was at a conference there, and I thought I'd surprise her with dinner. But, truth be told, I had a more pressing reason for the trip. For the past 3 months, I couldn't shake the feeling that Claire was seeing someone else. Every time she went on one of these work trips or training sessions, she came back later than expected. Tonight, I was determined to catch her in the act, if that's what it came to, and put an end to all the doubts that were eating me alive. Claire and I have been married for 14 years, and we have 2 amazing kids, Sarah, who's 12, and Jake, who's 10. They were staying with my mom for the night. Claire and I tied the knot right out of high school after dating for a couple of years. She was always this bright, cheerful woman with her long brown hair and a figure that could turn heads. But something changed a few months ago. Little things started bothering me, making me feel uneasy. I didn't want to come off as paranoid or jealous, so I kept my concerns to myself. This conference was conveniently close, so it gave me the perfect opportunity to drop by unannounced. When I got to the hotel, I handed my suit bag over to the front desk and introduced myself as Adam Taylor. I told the clerk that my wife, Claire, was attending the insurance conference in room 214, and she had said I could grab a key from the front desk. After verifying my identity, the clerk handed over the key, and I headed to the elevator, nerves jangling the whole way. My mind raced with questions about what I'd do if I caught her, how I'd handle it, whether I'd knock or just walk in, and if she'd be alone. As I made my way down the hallway, I decided I'd just use the key and see what was really going on. Trying to keep quiet, I slid the keycard into the door, opened it slowly, and there she was, sitting at the desk with her briefcase open, going through some paperwork. She turned around, clearly shocked to see me. I quickly explained that I had some free time and thought I'd drop in and take her to dinner. Claire seemed genuinely happy to see me, suggesting I stay the night and even saying she was looking forward to the company. She came over and planted a big kiss on me, and I realized my plan to catch her in the act had completely backfired. But then, as I made a joking comment about spending some time together before dinner, she responded with a sly smile and suggested we have a quick, intimate moment before she hopped in the shower. She even promised a full night of whatever I wanted afterward. I was relieved, thinking maybe I'd just been paranoid. We had a brief, passionate moment, and then Claire headed into the bathroom for her shower. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off my earlier suspicions, and sat down on the bed. As I sat there, my eyes landed on Claire's toiletry bag on the dresser. I decided to check it for some aspirin to ease the headache I'd gotten from all the driving. But instead of finding pills, I found something that made my heart sink, a pack of 6 condoms. I sat there, staring at the condoms, my mind spinning. After Jake was born, Claire had switched to birth control pills, but they made her nauseous. That's when I decided to get a vasectomy, and since then, we hadn't needed any form of contraception. So why on earth were there condoms in her bag? The answer hit me like a ton of bricks: Claire was cheating on me. There was no other explanation. But what was I supposed to do next? I couldn't just let this go. My mind raced through a million different options, and then, I did something I'm not particularly proud of. I rummaged through her bag and found a safety pin, the kind she always kept on hand for wardrobe malfunctions. Carefully, I used it to poke holes in the center of each condom before putting them back exactly where I'd found them. As Claire was finishing up in the shower, I grabbed my phone and called my friend, Rob. He's the kind of guy who would do anything for a friend, no questions asked. I told him I needed a favor, nothing too crazy, just a phone call. I explained that I wanted him to call me in about an hour and pretend that there was an emergency back home. I said something like a burst pipe at the school, something that would need my immediate attention. Rob agreed without hesitation, saying he'd call around 7. I didn't want to spend the night with Claire anymore, not after what I'd just discovered. The thought of being intimate with her made my skin crawl, so I figured I'd take Rob's call as an excuse to leave and sort through my thoughts on the drive back home. When Claire finally emerged from the bathroom, I could barely look at her. Every fiber of my being wanted to confront her right then and there, to demand answers. But I held back, knowing that losing my temper wouldn't help. I needed to keep it together and figure out my next move. We headed down to the hotel's dining room, and I was doing my best to act normal, but inside, I was falling apart. Claire seemed oblivious to my inner turmoil as we sat down at the table. I told her to order whatever she wanted, and she shrugged, saying she wasn't very hungry. She settled on a small filet mignon and suggested we get a bottle of rose to go with it. After we placed our order, I couldn't resist testing the waters a bit. I asked her if she was happy with our marriage. Without missing a beat, she said she was. She went on about how we had a nice home, 2 great kids, and a husband who loved her. She said she couldn't ask for more. I nodded along, but her words felt like a punch to the gut. How could she say that when she was sneaking around behind my back? I admitted that sometimes I doubted whether I was doing enough to keep her happy, but I made sure to emphasize how lucky I felt to have her as my wife. I even joked that sometimes I had to pinch myself to believe it was real. Claire called me a silly goose and said that's why I'd driven all the way down to see her, that I had nothing to worry about because she was happy and content. Our dinners arrived, and we made small talk throughout the meal, but my mind was elsewhere. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd found. Then, just as the plates were being cleared, my phone rang. It was Rob, right on schedule. I excused myself to the lobby to take the call, making sure to wait a few minutes before heading back to the table. When I returned, I told Claire that Rob had called to let me know about a burst pipe at the school, and I really needed to get back there as soon as possible. Claire's face fell, but I couldn't tell if she was genuinely disappointed or just annoyed that her evening had been cut short. Either way, it seemed like whether I stayed or left didn't matter much to her. She was going to face some consequences either way. As we headed back to the elevator, a man I didn't recognize stepped out and greeted Claire like an old friend. He introduced himself as Tom Bradley and mentioned that he'd stopped by her room earlier, but no one had answered. He extended his hand to me and said, "Claire talks about you all the time." "I'm Tom." I forced a smile and shook his hand, though it was difficult to fake the pleasantries. As we rode up in the elevator, I couldn't help but feel the knot in my stomach tighten. This was the guy, wasn't it? This was the man she was cheating with. Once we were back in the room, I turned to Claire and told her flat out that I wanted her to quit her job. I couldn't stand the idea of her working with Tom anymore. We'd talked about it before, but I needed to make it clear that this was non-negotiable. She shot back that she wasn't quitting and that I needed to get over my paranoia about her and Tom. She made it sound like I was the one with the problem, not her. After a quick, icy kiss, I grabbed my bags and left the hotel, my mind reeling with anger and betrayal. The whole drive home, I couldn't shake the image of Tom stopping by Claire's room. By the time I reached the house, I was a wreck. I hated her for what she was doing, and I hated myself for not being able to do anything about it. Divorce was the only thing on my mind, but without solid proof, I felt defeated. My wife was cheating, and I knew it, but I was stuck, unable to take action. 2 days later, Claire came home from the conference, acting as if everything was perfectly normal. She was cheerful, almost annoyingly so, which only fueled my anger. I had to do something. While she was busy unpacking, I couldn't help myself. I checked her bag again. There it was, one last condom, still with the tiny hole I'd poked in it. How many had she gone through in just those few days? The thought made me sick. That Saturday, the company Claire worked for, Liberty Insurance, hosted a picnic for employees and their families. The kids were excited about the day, but I wasn't looking forward to it at all. I had a hunch that some of her colleagues knew about the affair, and I dreaded the thought of becoming the subject of office gossip or crude jokes. I probably was being paranoid, but with everything going on, I couldn't help it. Claire was in her element, laughing and chatting with her coworkers, including Tom. They weren't openly affectionate or anything, but there was a closeness between them that I couldn't ignore. It was like everyone else disappeared when they talked. I tried to keep a low profile, not wanting to draw any attention to myself. A woman I hadn't met before, Janet Bradley, introduced herself, saying she was Tom's wife. She was stunning, long auburn hair, big blue eyes, the kind of woman who could have stepped right out of a magazine. For a moment, I was genuinely confused. How could Tom cheat on someone like her? I'd always thought highly of Claire, loved her even, but Janet was something else entirely. We exchanged pleasantries, and after a bit of small talk, we agreed to find a quieter spot to chat. We ended up on some benches near the lake, far enough from the picnic area that we could talk without being overheard. Sitting there, I could tell that Janet had something serious on her mind. She hesitated, clearly struggling to bring up the subject. I decided to make it easier for her. I told her that I'd found out about the affair just that week. The relief on her face was immediate. She admitted that she'd known for about 2 months and had already decided to file for divorce. She'd even hired a private investigator to gather evidence. Janet explained that her lawyer had suggested asking Claire to testify or at least sign a notarized statement about the affair to strengthen her case. I asked her what kind of proof she had, and she mentioned photos and taped phone conversations, though no videos yet. She believed the evidence she had was more than enough to make a solid case. Then, she asked if I'd be willing to use some of the same evidence in my own divorce proceedings. She also mentioned that she was planning to sue Liberty Insurance for negligence. Apparently, she had statements from other employees who knew about the affair and did nothing to stop it. Janet was determined to make Tom and Claire pay, one way or another. She suggested we work together, sharing whatever evidence we had, and I agreed. It made sense to team up. Before we headed back to the picnic, Janet invited me over to her house the next day. Tom was going golfing in the morning, and she thought it would be a good time to go over everything she'd gathered. She lived at 26 Hemlock Avenue in Crestmont, just a short drive from where we were. We both laughed a little, knowing that meeting up wasn't exactly a date, but it felt like we were in this together now. When we got back to the picnic area, it seemed like no one had noticed we were gone. I felt better, like maybe there was a way out of this mess after all. The next morning, as expected, Claire told me she was heading out to do some shopping and would be gone for a few hours. As soon as she left, I dropped the kids off at my mom's place and drove over to Janet's. She greeted me at the door, looking as composed as ever, and led me into her den. The room was cozy, with a large leather couch and a computer monitor on the table in front of it, showing an empty motel room. Janet motioned for me to sit down and offered me something to drink. I opted for a soda, specifically a Pepsi, and then asked her what was going on. Janet explained that we were about to watch Tom play a round of golf, live and in full color. She hinted that I might recognize the caddy he was with. When I asked how she'd set this up, she casually mentioned that it had cost her about $1,400, but she figured Tom would end up covering the bill one way or another. The session was supposed to last a couple of hours, so she encouraged me to get comfortable. She even had popcorn and nachos ready, and she promised to give me a DVD of the whole thing afterward. She admitted that while she didn't really want to see what was going to happen, she also didn't want to miss it. For the next 20 minutes or so, we made small talk. Janet shared more details about the affair, showing me photos, playing recordings, and laying out documents. The more she showed me, the more I realized just how deeply involved Claire and Tom were. It was heartbreaking, but at the same time, it was the proof I needed. Then, just as Janet had predicted, the monitor flickered to life. There they were, Tom and Claire, walking into the motel room together. They wasted no time, undressing almost immediately, with no small talk or foreplay. The video was clear, though the sound was a bit garbled. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, my wife, right there in front of me, with another man. Watching Claire and Tom like that was one of the most uncomfortable experiences of my life. Janet, trying to lighten the mood, made a comment about how you don't often see a body like Claire's. I forced a smile, but honestly, I had no idea how to respond. It was surreal, and I didn't want to keep watching. After a few minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. I turned to Janet and told her that I didn't need to see the rest. I figured she wasn't too keen on continuing either. Janet sighed and agreed, admitting that watching it was pretty painful. We decided to stop the video, acknowledging that the lawyers had enough evidence now. I confessed to Janet that seeing my wife like that, especially with her sitting right next to me, was something I could barely stomach. The whole thing just felt wrong. Janet nodded, understanding completely, and suggested that we do something else. I was relieved when she mentioned showing me her koi ponds in the backyard. That sounded much more appealing than watching another minute of the video. Her eyes lit up when I showed interest in her hobby, and she seemed genuinely excited to share it with me. As we walked out to the backyard, I couldn't help but think how much better this afternoon was turning out for me than it was for Claire. The koi ponds were incredible. Janet had 3 of them, and each one was more impressive than the last. She explained the pumping and filtration systems, and I found myself fascinated, especially with my background in plumbing. I offered to help her out anytime she needed it, just out of a desire to learn more about the koi ponds. Spending time with Janet was a bonus, but there was nothing romantic about it, at least not yet. We spent a few hours out there, the time flying by as we talked about everything but our cheating spouses. It was a welcome distraction. When we finally headed back inside, the motel room on the monitor was empty, signaling that Tom and Claire had left. It was time for me to go home. Janet walked me to the door and promised to call when Tom had his next golf game, suggesting that I bring Sarah and Jake over to see the koi ponds. It was a nice thought, something positive to look forward to in the midst of all this chaos. On the drive home, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, anger, and a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, I could get through this. The next few weeks were tough. Every time Claire took a shower, I found myself checking her bag, and every time, there was a new supply of condoms. I couldn't understand when she was finding the time to use them all. It was like she had some secret life I knew nothing about. I kept that safety pin on my keychain, ready to poke holes whenever I found another stash. Meanwhile, on the days when Tom had his golf games, I'd take the kids over to Janet's. They loved visiting the koi lady, as they called her. They'd draw pictures of the fish and proudly show them to Claire when we got home, but she never made the connection that Janet was Tom's wife. It was almost laughable how oblivious she was. Claire seemed relieved that I was able to keep the kids busy while she was otherwise engaged, as she put it. I tried talking to Claire a couple more times about quitting her job and ending things with Tom, but each time, I got the same cold rejection. The second time was particularly harsh, with her making digs about my masculinity and insinuating that I was the problem. It stung, but it also made it easier for me to justify everything I was doing. I started finding excuses to avoid being intimate with her, and the less we were together, the more distant I felt. Then, one night, Claire dropped a bombshell. She told me she'd been feeling really stressed out lately and thought it would be a good idea to take some time off work to visit her sister, Nancy, for a few days, maybe even a week. She said I'd been working so hard with all the overtime and late nights, and she thought it would be a chance for me to relax a little too. She made it sound like she was doing me a favor by taking this trip. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with everything I needed to do. Finally, the moment had come, and I had to act. The next day, after Claire left for her rest and recuperation trip, I started making my preparations. I had to explain the situation to my parents, admitting that I'd failed as a husband. They were incredibly supportive, offering to help in any way they could. The kids were thrilled to stay with their grandparents, and my dad's truck would be handy for moving Claire's stuff out of the house. On Thursday morning, I drove the 3 hours to the first clinic where I suspected Claire would go. But when I got there, I hit a dead end. That left me with one last option, the family planning center. I walked in, trying to look as confident as possible, and told the receptionist that I was Adam Taylor, and my wife, Claire, had sent me to sign some consent forms. I played dumb, acting like I wasn't sure what the exact form was called, but I mentioned that it was something about understanding the procedure and agreeing not to pursue any legal action. The receptionist nodded, checked her computer, and confirmed Claire's identity. She said Claire's sister had already signed for her, but my signature would be better. She handed me the file, and I quickly signed the form right beneath Nancy's signature. The procedure was scheduled for Friday morning at 11 a.m., with instructions to arrive an hour early. I asked if there were any remaining payments due, but the receptionist assured me that Claire had already paid the full $800 in cash. I thanked the receptionist and left the clinic, feeling both relieved and anxious. Now, I had everything in place. The reception I got when I arrived at Nancy and Brad's place was predictably awkward. Claire seemed genuinely surprised to see me, asking what I was doing there. I told her that my parents had offered to keep the kids for a few days, so I'd taken some sick leave and decided to visit them. I mentioned that I needed to unwind a bit, just like she did. The room fell silent, and I could practically see the wheels turning in their heads. I'd put them on the spot, and now they had to figure out how to deal with it. Nancy gave Brad a nod, and he disappeared into the kitchen with her. Claire tried to keep the conversation light, but I could tell she was on edge. When Brad came back, he suggested that we take his buddy Jack's boat out on the lake the next day, just to get away from everything. I agreed, saying that a day on the lake sounded perfect, even though I had no intention of going. The next morning, Jack was already waiting with the boat when I made it clear to Brad that I wasn't going anywhere. While he packed up lunch and stocked the cooler with beer, I just stood by the passenger door of his truck. When Brad asked if I was getting in, I told him flat out that I'd changed my mind. I wasn't going to waste the day on a boat with him and Jack. Instead, I told him to make the most of it because he'd have to deal with Nancy when he got back, and I doubted she'd be in a good mood. Brad tried to convince me to come along, even resorting to some light swearing and a few half-hearted threats. But after 5 minutes of back and forth, he realized I wasn't budging. Finally, he gave up, and he and Jack took off without me. Once they were out of sight, I headed back into the house, poured myself a cup of coffee, and turned off Claire's cell phone. I called my dad, who's always up early, and we chatted for about 2 hours while I ignored the constant call-waiting tones. I figured Brad must have been trying to reach Nancy to warn her, but I wasn't about to let that happen. Eventually, Claire and Nancy got up, and I said goodbye to my dad, preparing myself for the confrontation that was sure to follow. When Nancy's cell phone finally buzzed back to life, she and Claire had just about 5 minutes before they were supposed to be at the family planning center. I finished off the pot of coffee and brewed a fresh one for the two of them, knowing I was about to face some serious backlash. Claire looked at me, clearly annoyed, and asked what I was still doing there. I told her I wasn't in the mood for fishing and thought I'd stick around with them for the day. I suggested we find a nice place for lunch together since I had to leave that night anyway. Claire immediately shot down the idea, saying that she and Nancy had plans and didn't want me tagging along. She emphasized that they only saw each other a couple of times a year and that I had the whole week to spend with her. I wasn't having it. I pushed back, saying that since I'd driven all this way, the least she could do was spare me half a day. Nancy, clearly frustrated, left the room to make a phone call. Claire sat there, looking like she'd been hit by a truck, defeated. We could hear Nancy yelling at Brad on the phone, as if he'd committed some unforgivable sin by leaving me behind. Claire tried one last time to convince me not to come, saying their plans didn't involve me and that I'd just be in the way. I calmly insisted that I'd like to know what their plans were, so I could decide whether I wanted to join them or do something else. I even joked, asking if they were meeting up with some guys, which she quickly denied. Claire explained that they were planning to shop for personal items like bras, underwear, and nightgowns, things they didn't want a guy hanging around for. I shrugged and said most of those stores were in the mall, so I could easily find something else to do while they tried things on. I even offered to take them to a nice restaurant for lunch to make up for any inconvenience. Nancy reappeared in the doorway, glaring at me without saying a word. Claire could see that she wasn't going to win this argument, so she finally gave in, saying she needed to get dressed. About 20 minutes later, they both came downstairs, clearly irritated but resigned to the fact that I was coming with them. I suspected that the phone call Nancy had made was likely to the family planning center, possibly to reschedule the appointment since I'd said I was leaving that night. They probably figured they could wait me out and go after I left. I insisted on driving my car, making it clear that I wasn't about to let them ditch me somewhere. We stopped at a service station, and I took my sweet time filling up the tank, checking the oil and water, and cleaning the windshield. It was probably the longest I'd ever spent on a routine car maintenance, and they just sat there, fuming. When we finally got to the mall, I parked far away so we'd have a long walk to the entrance. Once inside, I let them do their thing, keeping my distance but making sure they knew I was there. They didn't seem to be enjoying themselves at all. Most of their time was spent whispering to each other and exchanging irritated looks. They bought a few things, but it was clear they were just going through the motions to make it seem like they were shopping. I kept an eye on them, but I wasn't really interested in what they were buying. The important thing was that I'd managed to delay the inevitable. The time for the appointment had passed, and I knew Claire would have to reschedule. I had no intention of stopping her from going through with it, but making it harder for her was my way of getting some small measure of control back. Around noon, we met up in the center court of the mall, just as we'd planned. We went to the Olive Garden for lunch, and afterward, we headed back to the house around 2 p.m. The car ride was filled with tension, but there wasn't much conversation. I could tell they were both furious with me, but I didn't care. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had the upper hand. When we got back to the house, I grabbed a beer and settled on the couch, feeling pretty satisfied with myself. A couple of hours later, Brad returned, only to face a verbal assault from Nancy that lasted a good 30 minutes. After she was done, he slipped out and disappeared until supper time. Later that evening, after the dishes were done, I asked Claire if we could talk privately in the kitchen. Nancy shot me a sneer but didn't say anything, and the two of them went into the living room. Claire was still upset from the day's events, and I could tell she wasn't going to be easy to deal with. But I was ready. I got straight to the point, telling her again that I wanted her to quit her job and end things with Tom Bradley. She clenched her teeth so tightly I thought they might crack, and she looked like she was barely holding herself back from hitting me. She insisted that she didn't want to hear it anymore, that I needed to stop bringing it up. Claire was fed up with me asking and said I already knew the answer wasn't going to change. She gave me an ultimatum: either change the subject or leave. I didn't back down. Instead, I reached into the manila envelope I'd brought with me and pulled out a legal-sized envelope. Inside were divorce papers. I told Claire that I'd asked her at least 10 times over the past 2 months to quit her job and end things with Tom, and each time, she'd refused. I suggested she sign the papers and mail them in. I even included a self-addressed, stamped envelope for her convenience. I told her she could have a lawyer look them over if she wanted, but I was done waiting for her to make a decision. Claire's face twisted in anger. She leaned across the table and hissed that I couldn't divorce her just because she wouldn't quit her job or stop being friends with someone I didn't like. She said there needed to be grounds for divorce, and I didn't have any. She was sure of it. Then she suggested I go home and get my act together, reminding me that she was my wife and had no intention of giving up her home or family just because I didn't like her work situation. I didn't say anything right away. Instead, I reached back into my envelope and pulled out a stack of photos. I placed 6 pictures on the table, each one showing Claire and Tom in various compromising positions. I asked her if that was enough grounds for divorce. Claire's face went pale, and for a moment, she looked like she might pass out. But then, instead of showing any remorse, she started screaming at me, telling me to stop putting the photos on the table. She accused me of spying on her and called me every name in the book, sneaky, underhanded, and worse. She demanded to know why I hadn't confronted her directly and accused me of being a pervert who got off on this kind of thing. She said my actions made her sick. At that moment, my cell phone rang. It was my dad, calling to let me know he'd be arriving in about 10 minutes with Claire's belongings. I hung up and turned back to Claire, who was still fuming. She asked who had called, and I calmly told her that my dad was bringing her stuff over to Nancy's place. I explained that I'd already changed the locks at our house and that if she'd forgotten anything, she could let me know, and I'd retrieve it for her. She sat there in stunned silence as I handed her the title to her car, which I'd signed over to her. I also gave her an envelope containing half of the money from our joint bank accounts, about $200. I outlined the visitation rights she'd have with the kids, once a week, with the possibility of an overnight stay once a month, but only if she made a statement attesting to the affair and had it notarized. I added that I had a DVD of her and Tom's little rendezvous at the Scandia Motel from May 10th. It was 2 hours long and showed everything that was in the pictures. I collected the photos from the table, telling her that I hadn't taken them myself, I wasn't that interested in her activities. What I couldn't stand was being lied to. Finally, I pulled out the last item from my envelope, the safety pin I'd been carrying around. I slid it across the table to Claire and explained that I'd used it to poke holes in all the condoms she'd been using for the past 2 months. I told her she'd gone through 48 rubbers in just 2 weeks, which was more than I ever dreamed she'd use. Her face turned beet red as she processed what I was saying. She called me a miserable weasel and said what I'd done was the most despicable thing she'd ever heard of. I wasn't fazed. I told her the most despicable thing was cheating on me. I admitted I might be a fool, but she was the one who had betrayed our marriage. I then let her know I had to go since my dad was pulling into the driveway. As I stood up to leave, I mentioned that she hadn't once apologized or shown any remorse for what she'd done. I said goodbye and wished her well with her upcoming procedure, not forgetting to mention that it was on Monday. That's when the tears finally came. Claire started crying as I walked out of the room. Nancy rushed in to comfort her, while Brad followed me out to the porch. He looked at me, trying to make sense of what had just happened, and said I couldn't throw away a 14-year marriage over what he called a misunderstanding. I challenged him, asking why Claire had come down to visit him and Nancy if that was the case. Brad looked down at his feet, clearly struggling with the truth. After a moment, he muttered an apology and offered to help unload the truck. We finished unloading in about 10 minutes while Claire continued crying in the kitchen. I didn't care why she was crying. To me, it was too little, too late. The next week, both Claire and Tom were fired from Liberty Insurance. Claire refused to sign the affidavit Janet's lawyer had requested, but my lawyer assured me that we had a strong enough case without it. I didn't hear from Claire after that night, not a word. She didn't even come to see the kids, but they didn't seem to miss her. They were bonding with Janet, and we spent a lot of time together as a family. There was no talk of romance between Janet and me, at least not yet. We were both focused on getting through our divorces and taking care of our kids. Over the next few months, I learned more about Coy than I ever thought possible, and I enjoyed every minute of it. Finally, after 4 long months, both divorces were finalized. Claire didn't fight hers, but Tom went down kicking and screaming. He lost everything, the house, the investments, and he ended up paying a hefty monthly alimony to Janet. A few days before Christmas, Claire showed up at the house with presents for the kids. I decided to be polite and not do anything to spoil the holiday spirit. She stayed for about 2 hours, playing the part of a doting mother, and then left as quietly as she had come. We didn't talk about the divorce or the affair. It was as if those events had never happened. After she left, I felt an odd sense of closure. The house was up for sale, and 2 months later, I moved in with Janet. Tom had taken a job in Omaha, and Claire had gone with him. 4 months later, Tom disappeared, not even telling Claire where he was going. She ended up moving back in with Nancy, who was going through her own divorce after Brad took a job on the Alaskan pipeline. Brad sent Nancy the divorce papers in the mail, and the two sisters became each other's support system, both abandoned by the men they tried to build their lives around. Meanwhile, things were going well for me and Janet. We were comfortable with each other, and she adored my kids, who felt the same way about her. We spent every moment we could together, and by June, we were planning our wedding. We'd moved past the trauma of our previous marriages and were looking forward to a fresh start. Life had finally settled into a peaceful, happy routine. As for the man Claire had left me for, he didn't fare too well. A few weeks after he disappeared, word got around that he'd been mugged outside his favorite bar. The attackers had beaten him pretty badly, leaving him with 5 broken ribs, busted kneecaps, and a lot of missing teeth. He'd also lost his wallet and one of his testicles in the assault. It seemed like karma had finally caught up with him, and his days of carefree cheating were over. Janet and I continued to grow closer, not just as partners but as a family. The kids and I were learning a lot about koi, and we spent many happy afternoons in the backyard, watching the fish and enjoying the quiet life we'd built together. After everything that had happened, it felt like we were finally getting the life we deserved. There was no more drama, no more deceit, just the simple joy of being together. One day, Janet surprised me by showing me a 6-bedroom villa she'd bought nearby, with the money she'd saved before selling the business. It was beautiful, with a large pool where we could spend hot summer days. Janet had also kept my old Jaguar XK140 hidden away in the garage. It had been sitting there all along, waiting for the day when we'd take it out for a drive down the coast. That day wasn't far off. We planned to take the car to a familiar French restaurant, one where the 3 of us, me, Janet, and the Jaguar, could enjoy a quiet meal and celebrate how far we'd come. And as for Claire, last I heard, she was still living with Nancy, trying to piece together a life after Tom's betrayal. But that was her problem now. I had finally moved on, ready to start a new chapter with Janet by my side, and we were both looking forward to the future.
Dear listeners, thank you for your incredible support and for tuning into my stories on YouTube. Your enthusiasm and feedback mean the world to me. Stay tuned for more exciting tales. Warm regards.